The Secret Agent, A Simple Tale, written in 1907 by Joseph Conrad. Chapter 6. The lady patroness of Michaelis, the ticket of leave apostle of humanitarian hopes, was one of the most influential and distinguished connections of the assistant commissioner's wife, whom she called Annie, and treated still rather as a not very wise and utterly inexperienced young girl. But she had consented to accept him on the friendly footing, which was by no means the case with all of his wife's influential connections. Married young and splendidly at some remote epoch of the past, she had had for a time a close view of great affairs and even some great men. She herself was a great lady. Old now in the number of her years, she had that sort of exceptional temperament which defies time with scornful disregard, as if it were a rather vulgar convention submitted to by the mass of inferior mankind. Many other conventions, easier to set aside, alas, failed to obtain her recognition, also on temperamental grounds, either because they bored her or else because they stood in the way of her scorns and sympathies. Admiration was a sentiment unknown to her. It was one of the secret griefs of her most noble husband against her. First, as always, more or less tainted with mediocrity, and next, as being in a way an admission of inferiority, and both were frankly inconceivable to her nature. To be fearlessly outspoken in her opinions came easily to her, since she judged solely from the standpoint of her social position. She was equally untrammeled in her actions, and as her tactfulness proceeded from genuine humanity, her bodily vigor remained remarkable, and her superiority was serene and cordial. 3 generations had admired her infinitely, and the last she was likely to see had pronounced her a wonderful woman. Meantime, intelligent, with a sort of lofty simplicity, and curious at heart, but not like many women, merely a social gossip. She amused her age by attracting within her ken, through the power of her great, almost historical social prestige, everything that rose above the dead level of mankind, lawfully or unlawfully, by position, wit, audacity, fortune or misfortune. Royal highnesses, artists, men of science, young statesmen, and charlatans of all ages and conditions, who, unsubstantial and light, bobbing up like corks, show the best direction of the surface currents, had been welcomed in that house, listened to, penetrated, understood, appraised, for her own edification. In her own words, she liked to watch what the world was coming to. And, as she had a practical mind, her judgment of men and things, though based on special prejudices, was seldom totally wrong, and almost never wrong-headed. Her drawing-room was probably the only place in the wide world where an assistant commissioner of police could meet a convict liberated on a ticket of leave on other than professional and official ground. Who had brought Michaelis there one afternoon, the assistant commissioner did not remember very well. He had a notion it must have been a certain member of Parliament of illustrious parentage and unconventional sympathies, which were the standing joke of the comic papers. The nobilities and even the simple notorieties of the day brought each other freely to that temple of an old woman's not ignoble curiosity. You never could guess whom you were likely to come upon being received in semi-privacy within the faded blue silk and gilt-frame screen, making a cozy nook for a couch and a few armchairs in the great drawing-room with its hum of voices and the groups of people seated or standing in the light of 6 tall windows. Michaelis had been the object of a revulsion of popular sentiment, the same sentiment which years ago had applauded the ferocity of his life sentence passed upon him for complicity in a rather mad attempt to rescue some prisoners from a police van. The plan of the conspirators had been to shoot down the horses and overpower the escort. Unfortunately, one of the police constables got shot too. He left a wife and 3 small children, and the death of that man aroused through the length and breadth of the realm, for whose defense, welfare, and glory men die every day as a matter of duty, an outburst of furious indignation, and a raging, implacable pity for the victim. 3 ringleaders got hanged. Michaelis, young and slim, locksmith by trade, and great frequenter of evening schools, did not even know that anybody had been killed. His part, with a few others, being to force open the door at the back of the special conveyance. When arrested, he had a bunch of skeleton keys in one pocket, a heavy chisel in another, and a short crowbar in his hand. Neither more or less than a burglar. But no burglar would have received such a heavy sentence. The death of the constable had made him miserable at heart, but the failure of the plot also. He did not conceal either of these sentiments from his empaneled countrymen, and that sort of compunction appeared shockingly imperfect to the crammed court. The judge, on passing sentence, commented feelingly upon the depravity and the callousness of the young prisoner. That made the groundless fame of his condemnation. The fame of his release was made for him on no better grounds by people who wished to exploit the sentimental aspect of his imprisonment, either for purposes of their own or for no intelligible purpose. He let them do so in the innocence of his heart and the simplicity of his mind. Nothing that happened to him individually had any importance. He was like those saintly men whose personality is lost in contemplation of their faith. His ideas were not in the nature of convictions. They were inaccessible to reasoning. They formed in all their contradictions and obscurities an invincible and humanitarian creed, which he confessed rather than preached, with an obstinate gentleness, a smile of pacific assurance on his lips, and his candid blue eyes cast down, because the sight of faces troubled his inspiration developed in solitude. In that characteristic attitude, pathetic in his grotesque and incurable obesity, which he had to drag like a galley slave's bullet to the end of his days, the assistant commissioner of police beheld the ticket of leave apostle filling a privileged armchair within the screen. He sat there by the head of the old lady's couch, mild-voiced and quiet, with no more self-consciousness than a very small child, and with something of a child's charm, the appealing charm of trustfulness. Confident of the future, whose secret ways had been revealed to him within the 4 walls of a well-known penitentiary, he had no reason to look with suspicion upon anybody. If he could not give the great and curious lady a very definite idea as to what the world was coming to, he had managed without effort to impress her by his unembittered faith, by the sterling quality of his optimism. A certain simplicity of thought is common to serene souls at both ends of the social scale. The great lady was simple in her own way. His views and beliefs had nothing in them to shock or startle her, since she judged them from the standpoint of her lofty position. Indeed, her sympathies were easily accessible to a man of that sort. She was not an exploiting capitalist herself. She was, as it were, above the play of economic conditions, and she had a great capacity of pity for the more obvious forms of common human miseries, precisely because she was such a complete stranger to them that she had to translate her conception into terms of mental suffering before she could grasp the notion of their cruelty. The assistant commissioner remembered very well the conversation between these two. He had listened in silence. It was something as exciting in a way, and even touching its foredoomed futility, as the efforts at moral intercourse between the inhabitants of remote planets. But this grotesque incarnation of humanitarian passion appealed somehow to one's imagination. At last Michaelis rose, and taking the great lady's extended hand, shook it, retained it for a moment in his great cushioned palm with unembarrassed friendliness, and turned upon the semi-private nook of the drawing-room his back, vast and square, and as if distended under the short tweed jacket. Glancing about in serene benevolence, he waddled along to the distant door between the knots of other visitors. The murmur of conversations paused on his passage. He smiled innocently at a tall, brilliant girl whose eyes met his accidentally, and went out unconscious of the glances following him across the room. Michaelis's first appearance in the world was a success of esteem unmarred by a single murmur of derision. The interrupted conversations were resumed in their proper tone, grave or light. Only a well-set-up, long-limbed, active-looking man of 40, talking with two ladies near a window, remarked out loud with an unexpected depth of feeling, 18 stone, I should say, and not 5'6". Poor fellow, it's terrible, terrible. The lady of the house, gazing absently at the assistant commissioner, left alone with her on the private side of the screen, seemed to be rearranging her mental impressions behind her thoughtful immobility of a handsome old face. Men with gray mustaches and full, healthy, vaguely smiling countenances approached, circling round the screen. Two mature women with a matronly air of gracious resolution, a clean-shaved individual with sunken cheeks, and dangling a gold-mounted eyeglass on a broad black ribbon with an old-world, dandified effect. A silence deferential, but full of reserves, resigned for a moment, and then the great lady exclaimed, not with resentment, but with a sort of protesting indignation, "And that officially is supposed to be a revolutionist. What nonsense!" She looked hard at the assistant commissioner, who murmured apologetically, "Not a dangerous one, perhaps." "Not dangerous? Should think not, indeed. He is a mere believer." "It's the temperament of a saint," declared the great lady in a firm tone, "and they kept him shut up for 20 years. One shudders at the stupidity of it. And now they have let him out. Everybody belonging to him is gone away somewhere, or dead. His parents are dead. The girl he was to marry has died while he was in prison. He has lost the skill necessary for his manual occupation. He told me all this himself, with the sweetest patience, but then he said he had plenty of time to think out things for himself. A pretty compensation. If that's the stuff revolutionists are made of, some of us may well go on their knees to them," she continued in a slightly bantering voice, while the banal society smiles hardened on the worldly faces turned towards her with conventional deference. "The poor creature's obviously no longer in a position to take care of himself. Somebody will have to look after him a little. He should be recommended to follow a treatment of some sort," the soldierly voice of the active-looking man was heard advising earnestly from a distance. He was in the pink of condition for his age, and even the texture on his long frock coat has a characteristic of elastic soundness to it, as if it were a living tissue. "The man is virtually a cripple," he added with unmistakable feeling. Other voices, as if glad of the opening, murmured hasty compassion. "Quite startling, monstrous, most painful to see." The lank man with the eyeglass on a broad ribbon pronounced mincingly the word grotesque, whose justness was appreciated by those standing near him. They smiled at each other. The assistant commissioner had expressed no opinions either then or later, his position making it impossible for him to ventilate any independent view of a ticket of leave convict. But in truth, he shared the view of his wife's friend and patron that Michaelis was a humanitarian sentimentalist, a little mad, but upon the whole incapable of hurting a fly intentionally. So, when that name cropped up suddenly in this vexing bomb affair, he realized all the danger of it for the ticket of leave apostle, and his mind reverted at once to the old lady's well-established infatuation. Her arbitrary kindness would not brook patiently any interference with Michaelis's freedom. It was a deep, calm, convinced infatuation. She had not only felt him to be inoffensive, but she had said so, which last, by a confusion of her absolute mind, became a sort of incontrovertible demonstration. It was as if the monstrosity of the man with his candid infant eyes and a fat, angelic smile had fascinated her. He had come to believe almost his theory of the future, since it was not repugnant to her prejudices. She disliked the new element of plurocracy in the social compound, and industrialization as a method of human development appeared to her singularly repulsive in its mechanical and unfeeling character. The humanitarian hopes of the mild Michaelis tended not towards utter destruction, but merely towards the complete economic ruin of the system. And she did not really see where was the moral harm of it. It would do away with all the multitude of the parvenists, whom she disliked and mistrusted, not because they had arrived anywhere, she denied that, but because of their profound unintelligence of the world, which was the primary cause of the crudity of their perceptions and the aridity of their hearts. With the annihilation of all capital, they would vanish too, but universal ruin, providing it was universal, as it was revealed to Michaelis, would leave the social values untouched. The disappearance of the last piece of money would not affect people of position. She could not conceive how it could affect her position, for instance. She had developed these discoveries to the assistant commissioner with all the serene fearlessness of an old woman who had escaped the blight of indifference. He had made for himself the rule to receive everything of that sort in a silence which he took care from policy and inclination not to make offensive. He had an affection for the aged disciple of Michaelis, a complex sentiment depending a little on her prestige, on her personality, but most of all on the instinct of flattered gratitude. He felt himself really liked in her house. She was kindness personified, and she was practically wise too, after the manner of experienced women. She made his married life much easier than it would have been without her generously full recognition of his rights as Annie's husband. Her influence upon his wife, a woman devoured by all sorts of small selfishnesses, small envies, small jealousies, was excellent. Unfortunately, both her kindness and her wisdom were of an unreasonable complexion, distinctly feminine and difficult to deal with. She remained a perfect woman all along her full tale of years, and not as some of them do become, a sort of slippery, pestilential old man in petticoats. And it was as of a woman that he thought of her, the specially choice incarnation of the feminine, wherein is recruited the tender, ingenious, and fierce bodyguard for all sorts of men who talk under the influence of an emotion, true or fraudulent, for preachers, seers, prophets, or reformers. Appreciating the distinguished and good friend of his wife, and himself in that way, the assistant commissioner became alarmed at the convict Michaelis's possible fate. Once arrested and on suspicion of being in some way, however remote, a party to this outrage, the man could hardly escape being sent back to finish his sentence at least. And that would kill him. He would never come out alive. The assistant commissioner made a reflection extremely unbecoming his official position without being really creditable to his humanity. If the fellow is laid hold of again, he thought, she will never forgive me. The frankness of such a secretly outspoken thought could not go without some derisive self-criticism. No man engaged in a work he does not like can preserve many saving illusions about himself. The distaste, the absence of glamour extend from the occupation to the personality. It is only when our appointed activities seem by a lucky accident to obey the particularly earnestness of our temperament that we can taste the comfort of complete self-deception. The assistant commissioner did not like his work at home. The police work he had been engaged on in a distant part of the globe had been the saving character of an irregular sort of warfare, or at least the risk and excitement of open-air sport. His real abilities, which were mainly of an administrative order, were combined with an adventurous disposition. Chained to a desk in the thick of 4 million men, he considered himself the victim of an ironic fate, the same, no doubt, which had brought about his marriage with a woman exceptionally sensitive in the matter of colonial climate, besides other limitations testifying to the delicacy of her nature and her tastes. Though he judged his alarms sardonically, he did not dismiss the improper thought from his mind. The instinct of self-preservation was strong within him. On the contrary, he repeated it mentally with profane emphasis and a fuller precision. Damn it, if that infernal heat has his way, the fellow will die in prison, smothered in his fat, and shall never forgive me. His black, narrow figure, with the white hand of the collar under the silvery gleams on the close-cropped hair at the back of the head, remained motionless. The silence had lasted such a long time that Chief Inspector Heat ventured to clear his throat. This noise produced its effect. The zealous and intelligent officer was asked by his superior, whose back remained turned to him immovably, "You connect my callus with this affair?" Chief Inspector Heat was very positive but cautious. "Well, sir," he said, "we have enough to go upon. A man like that has no business to be at large anyhow." "You will want some conclusive evidence," came the observation in a murmur. The Chief Inspector Heat raised his eyebrows at the black, narrow back, which remained obstinately presented to his intelligence and his zeal. "There will be no difficulty in getting up sufficient evidence against him," he said, with virtuous complacency. "You may trust me for that, sir," he added quite unnecessarily, out of the fullness of his heart, for it seemed to him an excellent thing to have the man in hand to be thrown down to the public should it think fit to roar with any special indignation in this case. It was impossible to say yet whether it would roar or not. That, in the last instance, depended, of course, on the newspaper press. But in any case, Chief Inspector Heat, purveyor of prisons by trade and a man of legal instincts, did logically believe that incarceration was the proper fate for every declared enemy of the law. In the strength of that conviction, he committed a fault of tact. He allowed himself a little conceited laugh and repeated, "Trust me for that, sir." This was too much for the forced calmness under which the assistant commissioner had for upwards of 18 months concealed his irritation with the system and the subordinates of his office. A square peg forced into a round hole. He had felt like a daily outrage at the long-established smooth roundness into which a man of his less sharply angular shape would have fitted himself with voluptuous acquiescence after a shrug or two. What he resented most was just the necessity of taking so much on trust. At the little laugh of Chief Inspector Heat's, he spun swiftly on his heels, as if whirled away from the window pane by an electric shock. He caught on the latter's face not only the complacency proper to the occasional lurking under the mustache, but the vestige of experimental watchfulness in the round eyes, which had been, no doubt, fastened on his back, and now met his glance for a second before the indent character of their stare had the time to change to a merely startled appearance. The Assistant Commissioner of Police had really some qualifications for his post. Suddenly his suspicion was awakened. It is by fair to say that his suspicions of the police methods unless the police happened to be a semi-military body organized by himself, was not difficult to arouse. If it ever slumbered from sheer weariness, it was but lightly, and his appreciation of Chief Inspector Heat's zeal and ability, moderate in itself, excluded all notion of moral confidence. "He's up to something," he exclaimed mentally, and at once became angry. Crossing over to his desk with headlong strides, he sat down violently. "Here I am stuck in a litter of paper," he reflected with unreasonable resentment. "Supposed to hold all the threads in my hand, and yet I can but hold what is put in my hand, and nothing else. And they can fasten the other ends of the thread where they please." He raised his head and turned towards his subordinate in a long, meager face with the accentuated features of an energetic Don Quixote. "Now what is it that you've got up your sleeve?" The other stared. He stared without winking, in a perfect immobility of his round eyes, as he was used to stare at the various members of the criminal class when, after being duly cautioned, they made their statements in the tones of injured innocence, or false simplicity, or sullen resignation. But behind that professional and stony fixity there was some surprise, too, for in such a tone, combining nicely the note of contempt and impatience, Chief Inspector Heat, the right-hand man of the department, was not used to be addressed. He began in a procrastinating manner, like a man taken unawares by a new and unexpected experience. "What I've got against that man Michaelis, you mean, sir?" The assistant commissioner watched the bullet head, the points of that Norse rover's mustache, falling below the line of the heavy jaw, the whole full and pale physiognomy, whose determined character was marred by too much flesh, at the cunning wrinkles radiating from the outer corners of the eye, and in that purposeful contemplation of the valuable and trusted officer, he drew a conviction so sudden that it moved him like an inspiration. "I have reason to think that when you came into this room," he said in measured tones, "it was not Michaelis who was in your mind, not principally, and perhaps not at all." "You have reason to think, sir?" muttered Chief Inspector Heat, with every appearance of astonishment, which up to a certain point was genuine enough. He had discovered in this affair a delicate and perplexing side, forcing upon the discoverer a certain amount of insincerity, that sort of insincerity which, under the name of skill, prudence, discretion, turns up at one point or another in most human affairs. He felt the moment like a tightrope artist might feel if suddenly, in the middle of the performance, the manager of the music hall were to rush out of the proper managerial seclusion and begin to shake the rope. Indignation, the sense of moral insecurity engendered by such a treacherous proceeding, joined to the immediate apprehension of a broken neck, would, in the colloquial phrase, put him in a state. And there would be also some scandalized concern for his art, too, since a man must identify himself with something more tangible than his own personality, and establish his pride somewhere, either in a social position or in the quality of the work he is obliged to do, or simply in the superiority of the idleness he may be fortunate enough to enjoy. "Yes," said the assistant commissioner, "I have. I do not mean to say that you have not thought of Michaelis at all, but you are giving up the fact that you've mentioned a prominence which strikes me as not quite candid, Inspector Heat. If that is really the track of discovery, why hadn't you followed it up at once, either personally or by sending one of your men to that village?" "Do you think, sir, I have failed in my duty there?" the chief inspector asked, in a tone which he sought to make simply reflective. Forced unexpectedly to concentrate his faculties Upon the task of preserving his balance, he had seized upon that point and exposed himself to a rebuke. For the assistant commissioner, frowning slightly, observed that this was a very improper remark to make. "But since you've made it," he continued coldly, "I'll tell you that is not my meaning." He paused with a straight glance of his sunken eyes, which was a full equivalent of the unspoken termination, "and you know it." The head of the so-called Special Crimes Department, debarred by his position from going out of doors personally in quest of secrets locked up in guilty breasts, had a propensity to exercise his considerable gifts for the detection of incriminating truth upon his very own subordinates. That peculiar instinct could hardly be called a weakness. It was natural. He was a born detective. It had unconsciously governed his choice of a career, and if it ever failed him in life, it was perhaps in the one exceptional circumstance of his marriage, which was also natural. It fed, since it could not roam abroad, upon the human material which was brought into its official seclusion. We can never cease to be ourselves. His elbows on the desk, his thin legs crossed, and nursing his cheek in his palm of his meager hand, the assistant commissioner in charge of the Special Crimes Branch was getting hold of the case with growing interest. His chief inspector, if not an absolutely worthy foeman of his penetration, was at any rate the most worthy of all within his reach. A mistrust of established reputations was strictly in character with the assistant commissioner's ability as detector. His memory evoked a certain old, fat, and wealthy native chief in the distant colony, whom it was a tradition for the successive colonial governors to trust and make much of as a firm friend and supporter of the order and legality established by white men, whereas when examined skeptically, he was found out to be principally his own good friend and nobody else's. Not precisely a traitor, but still a man of many dangerous reservations in his fidelity, caused by a due regard for his own advantage, comfort, and safety. A fellow of some innocence in his native duplicity, but none the less dangerous. He took some finding out. He was physically a big man, too, and allowing for the differences of color, of course, Chief Inspector Heat's appearance recalled to him the memory of his superior. It was not the eyes, nor yet the lips exactly. It was bizarre. But does not Alfred Wallace relate in his famous book on the Malay archipelago how among the Aru Islanders he discovered in an old and naked savage with a sooty skin a peculiar resemblance to a dear friend at home? For the first time since he took up his appointment, the assistant commissioner felt as if he were going to do some real work for his salary. And that was a pleasurable sensation. "I'll turn him inside out like an old glove," thought the assistant commissioner, with his eyes resting pensively upon Chief Inspector Heat. "No, that was not my thought," he began again. "There is no doubt about you knowing your business. No doubt at all. And that's precisely why He stopped short and changing his tone. "What could you bring up against Michaelis of a definite nature? I mean, apart from the fact that the two men under suspicion, you're certain there were two of them, came last from a railway station within 3 miles of that village where Michaelis is living now." "This by itself is enough for us to go upon, sir, with that sort of man," said the chief inspector with returning composure. The slight approving movement of the assistant commissioner's head went far to pacify the resentful astonishment of the renowned officer. For Chief Inspector Heat was a kind man, an excellent husband, a devoted father, and public and departmental confidence. He enjoyed acting favorably upon an amiable nature, disposed him to feel friendly towards the successive assistant commissioners he had seen pass through this very room. There had been 3 in his time. The first one, a soldierly, abrupt, red-faced person with white eyebrows and an explosive temper, could be managed with a silken thread. He left on reaching the age limit. The second, a perfect gentleman, knowing his own and everybody else's place to a nicety on resigning to take up a higher appointment out of England, got decorated for, really, Inspector Heat's services. To work with him had been a pride and a pleasure. The third, a bit of a dark horse from the first, was at the end of 18 months something of a dark horse still to the department. Upon the whole, Chief Inspector Heat believed him to be in the main harmless. Odd-looking, but harmless. He was speaking now, and the Chief Inspector listened with outward deference, which means nothing, being a matter of duty, and inwardly with benevolent toleration. Michaelis reported himself before leaving London for the country. Yes, sir, he did. And what may he be doing there? Continued the Assistant Commissioner, who was perfectly informed on that point, fitted with painful tightness into an old wooden armchair before a worm-eaten oak table in an upstairs room of a 4-room cottage with a roof of moss-grown tiles. Michaelis was writing night and day in a shaky, slanting hand that autobiography of a prisoner, which was to be like a book of revelation on the history of mankind. The conditions of confined space, seclusion, and solitude in a small 4-room cottage were favorable with his inspiration. It was like being in prison, except that one was never disturbed for the odious purpose of taking exercise according to the tyrannical regulations of his old home in the penitentiary. He could not tell whether the sun still shone on the earth or not. The perspiration of the literary labor dropped from his brow. A delightful enthusiasm urged him on. It was the liberation of his inner life, the letting out of his soul into the wide world, and the zeal of his guileless vanity, first awakened by that offer of £500 from a publisher, seemed something predestined and holy. It would be, of course, most desirable to be informed exactly, insisted the Assistant Commissioner uncandidly. Chief Inspector Heat, cautious of renewed irritation at this display of scrupulousness, said the county police had been notified from the first of Michaelis's arrival, and that a full report could be obtained in a few hours. A wire to the superintendent. Thus he spoke rather slowly, while his mind seemed already to be weighing the consequences. A slight knitting of the brow was the outward sign of this, but he was interrupted by a question. "You sent that wire already?" "No, sir," he answered, as if surprised. The Assistant Commissioner uncrossed his legs suddenly. The briskness of that movement contrasted with the very casual way in which he threw out the suggestion. "Would you think that Michaelis had anything to do with the preparation of that bomb, for instance?" The Chief Inspector assumed a reflective manner. "I wouldn't say so. There's no necessity to say anything at present. He associates with men who are classed as dangerous. He was made a delegate of the Red Committee less than a year after his release on license. A sort of compliment, I suppose." And the Chief Inspector laughed a little angrily, a little scornfully. With a man of that sort, scrupulousness was a misplaced and even an illegal sentiment. The celebrity bestowed upon Michaelis on his release 2 years ago by some emotional journalist in want of special copy had rankled ever since in his breast. It was perfectly legal to arrest that man on the barest suspicion. It was legal and expedient on the face of it. His 2 former chiefs would have seen the point at once, whereas this one, without saying either yes or no, sat there as if lost in a dream. Moreover, besides being legal and expedient, the arrest of Michaelis solved a little personal difficulty which worried Chief Inspector Heat somewhat. This difficulty had its bearing upon his reputation, upon his comfort, and even upon the efficient performance of his duties. For, if Michaelis no doubt knew something about this outrage, the Chief Inspector was fairly certain that he did not know too much. This was just as well. He knew much less, the Chief Inspector was positive, than certain other individuals he had in his mind, but whose arrest seemed to him inexpedient, besides being a more complicated matter on account of the rules of the game. The rules of the game did not protect so much Michaelis, who was an ex-convict. It would be stupid not to take advantage of legal facilities, and the journalist who had written him up with emotional gush would be ready to write him down with emotional indignation. The prospect, viewed with confidence, had the attraction of a personal triumph for Chief Inspector Heat, and deep down in his blameless bosom of an average married citizen, almost unconscious but potent nevertheless, the dislike of being compelled by events to meddle with the desperate ferocity of the professor had its say. This dislike had been strengthened by the chance meeting in the lane. The encounter did not leave behind with Chief Inspector Heat that satisfactory sense of superiority the members of the police force get from the unofficial but intimate side of their intercourse with the criminal classes, by which the vanity of power is soothed and the vulgar love of domination over the fellow creatures is flattered as worthily as it deserves. The perfect anarchist was not recognized in a fellow creature by Chief Inspector Heat. He was impossible, a mad dog to be left alone. Not that the Chief Inspector was afraid of him. On the contrary, he meant to have him some day, but not yet. He meant to get a hold of him in his own time, properly and effectively, according to the rules of the game. The present was not the right time for attempting that feat, nor the right time for many reasons, personal and of public service. This being the strong feeling of Inspector Heat, it appeared to him just and proper that this affair should be shunted off its obscure and inconvenient track, leading goodness knows where, into a quiet and lawful siding called Michaelis. And he repeated, as if considering the suggestion conscientiously, "The bomb? No, I would not say that exactly. We may never find that out, but it's clear that he is connected with this in some way, which we can find out without much trouble." His countenance had that look of grave, overbearing indifference, once well known and much dreaded by the better sort of thieves. Chief Inspector Heat, though what is called a man, was not a smiling animal, but his inward state was that of satisfaction at the passively receptive attitude of the Assistant Commissioner, who murmured gently, "And you really think that the investigation should be made in that direction?" "I do, sir." "Quite convinced?" "I am, sir. That's the true line for us to take." The Assistant Commissioner withdrew the support of his hand from his reclining head with a suddenness that, considering his languid attitude, seemed to menace his whole person with collapse. But, on the contrary, he sat up, extremely alert, behind the great writing table on which his hand had fallen with the sound of a sharp blow. "What I want to know is what put it out of your head till now." "Put it out of my head," repeated the Chief Inspector very slowly. "Yes, till you were called into this room, you know." The Chief Inspector felt as if the air between his clothing and his skin had become unpleasantly hot. It was the sensation of an unprecedented and incredible experience. "Of course," he said, exaggerating the deliberation of his utterance to the utmost limits of possibility, "if there is a reason of which I know nothing, for not interfering with the convict Michaelis, perhaps it's just as well I didn't start the county police after him. This took such a long time to say that the unflagging attention of the assistant commissioner seemed a wonderful feat of endurance. His retort came without delay. No reason whatsoever that I know of. Come, Chief Inspector, this finessing with me is highly improper on your part. Highly improper. And it's also unfair, you know. You shouldn't leave me to puzzle things out for myself like this. Really, I am surprised. He paused, then added smoothly, I need scarcely tell you that this conversation is altogether unofficial. These words were far from pacifying the chief inspector. The indignation of a betrayed tightrope performer was strong within him. In his pride of a trusted servant, he was affected by the assurance that the rope was not shaken for the purpose of breaking his neck, as by an exhibition of impudence, as if anybody were afraid. Assistant commissioners come and go, but a valuable chief inspector is not an ephemeral office phenomenon. He was not afraid of getting a broken neck. To have his performance spoiled was more than enough to account for the glow of honest indignation. As thought is no respecter of persons, the thought of Chief Inspector Heat took a threatening and prophetic shape. You, my boy, he said to himself, keeping his round and habitually roving eyes fastened upon the assistant commissioner's face. You, my boy, you don't know your place, and your place won't know you very long either, I bet. As if in provoking answer to that thought, something like a ghost of an amiable smile passed on the lips of the assistant commissioner. His manner was easy and businesslike while he persisted in administering another shake to the tightrope. Let us come now to what you have discovered on the spot, Chief Inspector, he said. A fool and his job are soon parted, went on the train of pathetic thought in Chief Inspector Heat's head, but it was immediately followed by the reflection that a higher official, even when fired out, this was the precise image, has still the time as he flies through the door to launch a nasty kick at the shin bones of the subordinate, without softening very much the basilisk nature of his stare. He said impassively, We are coming to that part of my investigation, sir. That's right. Well, what have you brought away from it? The chief inspector, who had made up his mind to jump off the rope, came to the ground with a gloomy frankness. I've brought away an address, he said, pulling out of his pocket, without haste, a singeing rag of dark blue cloth. This belongs to the overcoat of the fellow who got himself blown to pieces was wearing. Of course, the overcoat may not have been his, and may even have been stolen, but that's not all probable if you look at this. The chief inspector, stepping up to the table, smoothed out carefully the rag of blue cloth. He had picked it up from the repulsive heap at the mortuary, because a tailor's name is found sometimes under the collar. It is not often of much use, but still, he only half expected to find anything useful. But certainly he did not expect to find, not under the collar at all, but stitched carefully on the underside of the lapel, a square piece of calico with an address written on it in marking ink. The chief inspector removed his smoothing hand. I carried it off with me without anybody taking notice, he said. I thought it best. It can always be produced if required. The assistant commissioner, rising a little on his chair, pulled the cloth over to his side of the table. He sat looking at it in silence. Only the number 32 and the name of Brett Street were written in marking ink on a piece of calico slightly larger than an ordinary cigarette paper. He was genuinely surprised. Can't understand why he should have gone about labeled like this, he said, looking up at Chief Inspector Heat. It's a most extraordinary thing. I met once in the smoking room of a hotel an old gentleman who went about with his name and address sewn in on all his coats, in case of an accident or sudden illness," said the chief inspector. "He professed to be 84 years old, but he didn't look his age. He told me he was also afraid of losing his memory suddenly, like those people he has been reading of in the newspapers." A question from the assistant commissioner, who wanted to know what was 32 Brett Street, interrupted that reminiscence abruptly. The chief inspector, driven down to the ground by unfair artifices, had elected to walk the path of unreserved openness. If he believed firmly that to know too much was not good for the department, the judicious holding back of knowledge was as far as his loyalty dared to go for the good of the service. If the assistant commissioner wanted to mismanage this affair, nothing, of course, could prevent him. But, on his own part, he now saw no reason for a display of alacrity, so he answered concisely. "It's a shop, sir." The assistant commissioner, with his eyes lowered on the rag of blue cloth, waited for more information. As that did not come, he proceeded to obtain it by a series of questions propounded with gentle patience. Thus he acquired an idea of the nature of Mr. Verloc's commerce, of his personal appearance, and heard at last his name. In a pause, the assistant commissioner raised his eyes and discovered some animation on the chief inspector's face. They looked at each other in silence. "Of course," said the latter, "the department has no record of that man." "Did any of my predecessors have any knowledge of what you have told me now?" asked the assistant commissioner, putting his elbows on the table and raising his joined hands before his face, as if about to offer a prayer, only that his eyes had not a pious expression. "No, sir, certainly not. What would have been the object? That sort of man could never be produced publicly to any good purpose. It was sufficient for me to know who he was, and to make use of him in a way that could be used publicly." "And do you think that sort of private knowledge consistent with the official position you occupy?" "Perfectly, sir. I think it's quite proper. I will take the liberty to tell you, sir, that it makes me what I am, and I am looked upon as a man who knows his work. It's a private affair of my own. A personal friend of mine in the French police gave me the hint that the fellow was an embassy spy. Private friendship, private information, private use of it. That's how I look upon it." The assistant commissioner, after remarking to himself that mental state of the renowned chief inspector, seemed to affect the outline of his lower jaw, as if the lively sense of his high professional distinction had been located in that part of his anatomy, dismissed the point for the moment with a calm, "I see." Then, leaning his cheek on his joined hands, "Well then, speaking privately if you'd like, how long have you been in private touch with this embassy spy?" To this inquiry, the private answer of the chief inspector, so private that it was never shaped into audible words, was, "Long before you were even thought of for your place here." The so to speak public utterance was much more precise. "I saw him for the first time in my life a little more than 7 years ago, when 2 imperial highnesses and an imperial chancellor were on a visit here. I was put in charge of all the arrangements for looking after them. Baron Stott Warntenheim was ambassador then. He was a very nervous old gentleman. One evening, 3 days before the Guildhall banquet, he sent word that he wanted to see me for a moment. I was downstairs, and the carriages were at the door to take the imperial highnesses and the chancellor to the opera. I went up at once. I found the baron walking up and down his bedroom in a pitiable state of distress, squeezing his hands together. He assured me he had the fullest confidence in our police and in my abilities, but he had there a man just come over from Paris whose information could be trusted implicitly. He wanted me to hear what that man had to say. He took me at once into a dressing room next door, where I saw a big fellow in a heavy overcoat sitting all alone in a chair and holding his hat and stick in one hand. The baron said to him in French, 'Speak, my friend.' The light in that room was not very good. I talked with him for some 5 minutes, perhaps. He certainly gave me a piece of startling news. Then the Baron took me aside nervously to praise him up to me, and when I turned around again, I discovered that the fellow had vanished like a ghost. Got up and sneaked out down some back stairs, I suppose. There was no time to run after him, as I had to hurry off after the ambassador down to the great staircase and see the party started safe for the opera. However, I acted upon the information that very night. Whether it was perfectly correct or not, it did look serious enough. Very likely it saved us from an ugly trouble on the day of the imperial visit to the city. Some time later, a month or so after my promotion to chief inspector, my attention was attracted to a big burly man. I thought I had seen him somewhere before, coming out in a hurry from a jeweler's shop in the Strand. I went after him, as it was on my way towards Charing Cross, and there seeing one of our detectives across the road, I beckoned him over and pointed out the fellow to him, with instructions to watch his movements for a couple of days, and then report to me. No later than the next afternoon, my man turned up to tell me that the fellow had married his landlady's daughter at the registrar's office that very day, 11:30 a.m., and had gone off with her to Margate for a week. Our man had seen the luggage being put on the cab. There were some old Paris labels on one of the bags. Somehow I couldn't get the fellow out of my head, and the very next time I had to go to Paris on service, I spoke about him to that friend of mine in the Paris police. My friend said, "From what you tell me, I think you must mean a rather well-known hanger-on and emissary of the Revolutionary Reg Committee. He says he is an Englishman by birth. We have an idea that he has been for a good few years now a secret agent of one of the foreign embassies in London." This woke up my memory completely. He was the vanishing fellow I saw sitting in a chair in Barrett Stott-Wartenheim's bathroom. I told my friend that he was quite right. The fellow was a secret agent to my certain knowledge. Afterwards, my friend took the trouble to ferret out the complete record of that man for me. I thought I had better know all there was to know, but I don't suppose you want to hear his history now, sir? The assistant commissioner shook his supported head. "The history of your relations with the useful personage is the only thing that matters just now," he said, closing slowly his weary, deep-set eyes, and then opening them swiftly with a greatly refreshed glance. "There's nothing official about them," said the chief inspector bitterly. "I went into his shop one evening, told him who I was, and reminded him of our first meeting. He didn't as much as twitch an eyebrow. He said that he was married and settled now, and that all he wanted was not to be interfered in his little business. I took it upon myself to promise him that, as long as he didn't go in for anything obviously outrageous, he would be left alone by the police. That was worth something to him, because a word from us to the custom house people would have been enough to get some of these packages he gets from Paris and Brussels opened in Dover, with confiscation to follow for certain, and perhaps a prosecution as well at the end of it." "That's a very precarious trade," murmured the assistant commissioner. "Why did he go in for that?" The chief inspector raised scornful eyebrows dispassionately. "Most likely got a connection. Friends on the continent, amongst people who deal in such wares. They would be just the sort he would consort with. He's a lazy dog, too, like the rest of them." "What do you get from him in exchange for your protection?" The chief inspector was not inclined to enlarge on the value of Mr. Verloc's services. "He would not be much good to anybody but myself. One has got to know a good deal beforehand to make use of a man like that. I can understand the sort of hint he can give, and when I want a hint, he can generally furnish it to me." The chief inspector lost himself suddenly in a discreet, reflective mood, and the assistant commissioner repressed a smile at the fleeting thought that the reputation of Chief Inspector Heat might possibly have been made in a great part by the secret agent Verloc. In a more general way of being of use, all our men of the Special Crimes Section on duty at Charing Cross and Victoria have orders to take careful notice of anybody they may see with him. He meets the new arrivals frequently, and afterwards keeps track of them. He seems to have been told off for that sort of duty. When I want an address in a hurry, I can always get it from him. Of course, I know how to manage our relations. I haven't seen him to speak to 3 times in the last 2 years. I drop him a line, unsigned, and he answers me in the same way at my private address. From time to time, the assistant commissioner gave an almost imperceptible nod. The chief inspector added that he did not suppose Mr. Verloc to be deep in the confidence of the prominent members of the Revolutionary International Council, but that he was generally trusted, of that there could be no doubt. Whenever I've had reason to think there was something in the wind, he concluded, I've always found he could tell me something worth knowing. The assistant commissioner made a significant remark. He failed you this time. Neither had I wind of anything in any other way, retorted Chief Inspector Heat. I asked him nothing, so he could tell me nothing. He isn't one of our men. It isn't as if he were in our pay. No, muttered the assistant commissioner. He's a spy in the pay of a foreign government. We could never confess to him. I must do my work in my own way, declared the chief inspector. When it comes to that, I would deal with the devil himself and take the consequences. There are things not fit for everybody to know. Your idea of secrecy seems to consist in keeping the chief of your department in the dark. That's stretching it perhaps a little too far, isn't it? He lives over his shop? Who, Verloc? Oh, yes. He lives over his shop. The wife's mother, I fancy, lives with them. Is the house watched? Oh, dear, no. It wouldn't do. Certain people who have come there are watched. My opinion is that he knows nothing of this affair. How do you account for this? The assistant commissioner nodded at the cloth rag lying before him on the table. I don't account for it at all, sir. It's simply unaccountable. It can't be explained by what I know. The chief inspector made those admissions with the frankness of a man whose reputation is established as if on a rock. At any rate, not this present moment. I think that the man who had the most to do with it will turn out to be Michaelis. You do? Yes, sir, because I can answer for all the others. What about the other man supposed to have escaped from the park? I should think he's far away by this time, opined the chief inspector. The assistant commissioner looked hard at him and rose suddenly as though having made up his mind to some course of action. As a matter of fact, he had at that very moment succumbed to a fascinating temptation. The chief inspector heard himself dismissed with the instructions to meet his superior early the next morning for further consultation upon the case. He listened with an impenetrable face and walked out of the room with measured steps. Whatever might have been the plans of the assistant commissioner, they had nothing to do with that desk work, which was the bane of his existence because of its confined nature and the apparent lack of reality. Or else the general air of alacrity that came upon the assistant commissioner would have been inexplicable. As soon as he was left alone, he looked for his hat impulsively and put it on his head. Having done that, he sat down again to reconsider the whole matter. But as his mind was already made up, this did not take long, and before Chief Inspector Heat had gone very far on his way home, he also left the building.